Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from U.S. tax to the OECD's latest developments. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. PwC's Pillar 2 engine, powered by Beacon, is a game changer for Pillar 2 compliance, provision, and modeling calculations. Built on a graph system utilizing over 20 years of international tax technology, this cloud-based centralized rules engine is developed by a team of Pillar 2 tax experts from around the globe. PwC's Pillar 2 engine is currently available as a service and is now available to license. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're back in PwC's Policy on Demand studio in Washington, D.C., where I'm thrilled to have Beth Bell on the podcast. Beth recently joined PwC as a principal in our Washington National Tax Services Policy Office. Prior to joining PwC, Beth was a senior advisor to the U.S. Treasury Department, tax counsel for the U.S. House Committee on Ways and Means, and also served as a policy director and tax counsel in the United States Senate. Beth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
It's fantastic to finally have you on. I had an insane travel schedule when you had joined PwC, and I'm fascinated to talk to you today about the origin of Pillar 2. And you have a very unique background in that you kind of started your government career in the Senate. You were then worked in the House and the House Ways and Means, and then you were in Treasury. And all during that time of kind of TCJA and the origins of the Pillar 2 project and the inception of those rules. And you were there for the full Democratic administration and Congress with the Biden, and then Trump 2.0 with a full Republican Congress before you joined PwC. But before we get into that, and I'm sure the audience is very exciting, I must ask you a question because this is very important for the guests that come on the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
Okay.
Are you a baseball fan? And do you have a team, or what are your views on baseball, Beth?
So, I know you're a fan.
Yeah.
But my disappointing answer is I grew up an American football fan.
Okay.
Chicago Bears are my team. I watched baseball a little bit. Even though my family's from Chicago, grew up in New Jersey. So if I had to choose, it would be the Yankees, but I don't know that's a popular answer either.
Well, it's popular in New York, for sure. That's all right. I mean, none of my audience is really interested in baseball for me, but I'm kind of trying to force it upon them. I will make a comment about the NFL, which I think I have made on the podcast before.
Okay.
I used to be a fan when I was growing up of the St. Louis Cardinals. They took that team away from me. This is hard for people outside the U.S. to understand, that franchises can just move cities in U.S. American professional sports, and then that team was taken away from me, and then we got the St. Louis Rams, which I was very excited about. We won the Super Bowl in '99. It was the greatest show on turf, and then they took that team away from my hometown. So I have quit the NFL. My Sundays are free now, and I'm just a college football kind of guy. But I used to be a big NFL and football fan.
I understand it's brutal. It's too much loss.
And I also have gotten feedback, particularly from some of our audience outside the U.S., that I shouldn't turn this into a sports talk podcast, which is not the intention. What I want to talk about is, and particularly get some of your some of your experiences working in government and working in Congress. And maybe before we dive into the Pillar 2 stuff, as I mentioned, you had the privilege to experience both chambers of Congress. Which are the two legislative branches of government here in the U.S. How do you compare your experience as Senate tax counsel, which you were there from 2013 to early 2019, to your time as tax counsel for House Ways and Means, which you were there from 2019 to 2023?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I'm going to make it even a little more nuanced. I'm going to explain.
Please.
I'm going to explain. So when I was on the Senate side, it wasn't only that there was this distinction between the Senate and the House. I was also in a personal office of a senator compared to a committee office. And so, what that means is that instead of working on a committee where you serve all of the members, the chairman's the primary person who you work for, but you're really meant to take care of the interests of the membership, put coalitions together, things like that. When you're in a personal office, you're really just looking at the priorities of the member who you're serving. Sure. And so I worked for Ben Cardin from Maryland, so I did a lot of his tax housing, trade, economic policy work, but it's all with a Maryland lens. You get really kind of used to being in a lane where you're working on behalf of a specific set, a specific delegation.
Sure.
And that's much different than being on a committee. So when I was in the House, I was on the Ways and Means Committee, and even in the, even in the House side, people say, oh, it's more of a team sport because all the senators have this equal amount of power. In the House, it's a little more difficult. You have to, there's a lot of members. You have to form coalitions, caucuses to try to get your point across. Really serving on a committee means you're kind of getting the whole gang together to move a big product forward that has everyone's equities in it. And it's a balance between making sure the chairman is satisfied with the product, making sure you communicate with House leadership, but also make sure all the members are taken care of. So gosh, they're very different roles, but I think they all feed into the same types of political pressures and compromises that congressional staff are actually quite good at making and working together, despite what you see on TV these days, I would say.
And remind listeners, what is the House Ways and Means Committee? You talk about this committee that is part of the House of Representatives, but this really is where all tax legislation begins. And this is why we have so many, we've had a number of former, both members of the House Ways and Means and staffers, but maybe explain to listeners, what is the House Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives and why is that so important from a tax perspective?
Yes, so Ways and Means, this is a good clarification. The Ways and Means Committee has jurisdiction over many things. The most important thing for our conversation is the tax code. So congressional committees are usually divided by subject area and by the area of their legislative jurisdiction, we call it. So the area of law that they're allowed to amend. And Ways and Means has a very big area of law that they're allowed to amend, and part of that is the tax code. Another part of it relates to health, by the way, which is another huge big topic. Sure. But sticking with tax, the House of Representatives itself also has the constitutional prerogative to start revenue measures. And so not only do you have Ways and Means, which has the authority to amend the tax code, but also the House of Representatives over the Senate, even though we can talk about some legislative tomfoolery in terms of getting around this restriction, actually is constitutionally the chamber that starts tax legislation and other revenue measures.
Helpful. So how do you compare those experiences, sort of representing the legislative branch, to then moving over into the Treasury Department, when you move that into 2023, where you would represent the executive branch? So now kind of one singular boss, I assume, or what is that like?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I didn't know whether the skill set would carry over, but it did in some respects. Absolutely right that the powers of the executive very different from the powers of Congress, and kind of the pressures on you are a lot different. In Congress, you lead. I'm not saying policy doesn't matter, by the way, but you lead with a lot of political arguments. If you want to get something done, it's very difficult to do so without saying, these are the politics, they're in our favor, let's work on this. That applies in the executive branch as well, but I think there's a little bit more of an emphasis on policy in the first instance. There's a different set of pressures because, at least in my role at Treasury, I wasn't negotiating with a domestic entity within the Congress, but with other foreign governments, which can be a totally different ballgame in terms of the diplomatic pressures you're facing, kind of the geopolitical angles that you have to take into account. I'm not saying Congress doesn't think of those things, but it's just it's very different representing the government of the United States as opposed to the Congress of the United States. But in many ways, kind of the coalition building stayed the same. The kind of trying to find interest among folks, and I don't even mean the foreign governments, but also among the different agencies, because
Sure.
there are a lot of interagency dynamics that happen in the executive branch, also kind of similar to doing the same type of work in Congress. So a lot of overlap, but the mandate and the actors you're dealing with quite different.
Okay, maybe this is going to be a teaser because we're going to dive more into this, but you talked about working with foreign governments while you were part of the Treasury Department. Can you share some of the experiences in the context of Pillar 2 and some of those discussions, reactions when you were in your role in Treasury? And I will remind listeners that while you were at the Treasury Department representing the executive branch, it was originally Biden who was the president, and then Trump became the president. So you had the opportunity to serve as in the Treasury Department under both presidents.
Yes, so I served through the transition. I was with the, I was career staff, so I wasn't politically appointed, but I was serving with the Biden administration from 23 to 25, and then with the Trump administration for the first 8 months of 25. What I mainly handled was multilateral negotiations, so the OECD work, along with many others, by the way. But mainly on Pillar 2. At the more political level, I often accompanied our political appointees while they sat at the table at the OECD. Also, I was at the UN back when the U.S. participated in the UN negotiations on taxes, and also did some of our G7 and G20 work. So in the Pillar 2 context, what that really meant for my day-to-day and my role was I would go into whenever the OECD would convene, say, the steering group of the inclusive framework, to try to find, under the Biden administration, a path forward on Pillar 1. Or in the Pillar 2 context, to think about ways you could potentially improve the treatment of non-refundable tax incentives. That discussion started under the Biden administration. Because at the time, it was a well-known political problem, and I think that there was a lot of desire to try to remove that political obstacle should a Democratic presidency come in, and try to pass Pillar 2 legislation again. So those are the types of discussions I would be involved in at the Treasury Department. Moving over to the Trump administration side, there was a huge pivot in strategy, and so
which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Right?
Yes, absolutely. But it's interesting sitting at the table. You're often, as some in your audience, maybe everybody in your audience expects, but just to say it, a lot of the delegates stay the same.
Yeah.
I think the U.S. structure is really unique in that you have the career folks, but then you have a new set of political appointees coming in like once every 2 years. A lot of the other delegates remain like a pretty stable group of folks. And so having to represent the pivot from, we might be in an administration where, perhaps we'll take another run at Congress and legislating Pillar 2 in the future, to go from now we need to work on the side-by-side projects. It's very interesting. But anyway, it was the same type of role, just very different objective, very different kind of underlying political philosophy behind the negotiations.
Yeah, and I think everybody's aware of that.
Yes. I'm not breaking news here?
No,
okay.
that's not breaking news on the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast. All right, so let's go back now to some of the very origins of Pillar 2. And I'm really interested in that congressional sort of lens and the experience that you had working both in the Senate, as we talked about, and then in the House. On a couple of prior podcasts, I had the honor an opportunity to be able to interview Pascal Saint-Amand, and we got the perspective from the OECD. Professor Attai Grinberg, who was Deputy Head of International Tax for Treasury during the Biden administration, he shared his experiences and kind of explaining, and also talked about Build Back Better, which I want to get your perspective on. But when do you first really recall hearing about Pillar 2? And we go all the way back to 2019. The OECD had released a work plan. There was so much oxygen was dedicated to Pillar 1, Pillar 1, Pillar 1. And then Pillar 2 kind of, I feel like, reared its head, and I'm sure there were discussions behind the scenes, really in 2019. And then the OECD had their tax conference, and there were delegates from from all over the world, including from the Trump 1.0 administration. What is your recollection? This is 6 years ago, but when do you first remember hearing about Pillar 2? And then I want to talk a little bit more about Build Back Better and the Biden administration's and Professor Grinberg's role in trying to move that forward.
Yeah, so this is a good question. It was 100% related to Pillar 1. So we did hear about it in 2019, but it was such a secondary issue compared to the DST issue for Congress. The whole thing that brought this into the congressional purview including Pillar 1, like both pillars, was really the DST issue to begin with. That's what I remember Congress focusing on the most. And it was really kind of the trade actions that surrounded some of the digital services tax issues, the need to be briefed by both Treasury and USTR, that brought the negotiations really into at least the members' imaginations in terms of, okay, what's going on at the OECD. It was in 2019, but I can't overemphasize how much it was more focused on DSTs.
Sure. Yeah.
Bright, shiny thing that was Pillar 1. What are we going to do? Like a reallocation of taxing rights. This seems exciting. This seems interesting and new. Compared to Pillar 2, which, we were post TCJA and people had already been like, minimum tax, get it. Maybe this is more of a intra-European competition thing, that we're not quite privy to those negotiations, but it was very DST and Pillar 1 focused.
Yeah, and I remember it feels like a lot longer than 6 years ago, frankly, Beth. But
yes.
When those initial discussions were happening, it was kind of like everybody was focused on Pillar 1,
yes.
exactly as you described, and then. In that meeting with the OECD, they talked about the income inclusion rule and then this idea of the undertax payment rule that was coming on the heels of TCJA, right? So GILTI and BEAT, and it was kind of like, oh, well, this is like, in my naive view, it's like, oh, this is kind of like GILTI and BEAT for the rest of the world. The U.S. already has that. We weren't spending too much time thinking about that, and a lot has changed
yes.
in those 6 years. Pillar 1, people say on life support. I think some have described it as a zombie walking around with the axe in its head, but we're not allowed to talk about Pillar 1. I have publicly said on the podcast that Pillar 1's not happening. People continue to talk about it, but here we are, Pillar 2 enacted in 55 jurisdictions. It's taken on a life of its own. So let's go back to 2020 then. So 2019 was kind of introduced. The Democrats took control of both chambers of Congress and the presidency. Professor Grinberg on the podcast talked a lot about some of the challenges that he had during the transition, working for Secretary Yellen and getting some of the information and the data he needed. And then really kind of jumping, into the Pillar 2 discussions and negotiations. At the same time, the Biden administration and Congress were working together on Build Back Better. Maybe can you talk about what was Congress's involvement in the Pillar 2 discussions that were really led by the Treasury Department? And ultimately, I want to compare that to sort of the Trump administration and what happened when he took over. But what was Congress's really involvement in that when Biden took over and the Democrats had complete control of Congress?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, and I just want to put us in the moment of time
Please
that
do.
we were in, because I remember well that election, and it was a close election. There were special elections in Georgia that determined the control of the Senate, and so for a while, on the Democratic side, we were thinking, oh, maybe we're going to have a split Congress this year, so maybe not a lot is going to happen. But then all of a sudden we had unified Democratic control, and the key was turned, the engines are going. It's like we are going to legislate, and we were just also coming out of the depths of the COVID pandemic. And what we legislated first, and I swear I'm getting to Pillar 2 stuff.
Okay, no, it's good. This is helpful context.
But what we legislated first was the American Rescue Plan. And that was actually very COVID-specific relief, some extension of a lot of important relief programs that Congress felt strongly about at the time. And it was done super quickly for one of those reconciliation bills. I think it was done by March maybe, which is crazy when you just think of an administration comes in and towards the end of January, and all of a sudden you have a big, massive piece of legislation done by March. I can't overemphasize at the time how much the unified Democratic Congress, well, they were very interested in their own equities, coming off of the first Trump presidency, wanted to support President Biden. And that's really important context to kind of just to set the stage for what would eventually, become the next reconciliation battle, which was much more difficult. So I think coming off of the American Rescue Plan, there might have been this thought on the executive branch side that, oh, this is going to be easy because I have this congressional support, behind the president, which was totally legit, totally true. And I got this bill done in 90 days.
Yeah.
So this next bill, let's push forward more of our priorities. Let's see what's going to happen. I think the difference was, when we saw this play out, was there was a lot of support for wanting to politically boost the president, but a COVID bill, a COVID relief bill, that is just on the heels of an unexpected Democratic victory is much different from unleashing every House and Senate Democratic member to pull out the thing that they've wanted to do for years over a Trump presidency and say, here's your vehicle to do everything you've ever imagined.
Right.
And so it became a very messy legislative type of debate because...
And what you're talking about is the Build Back Better Act,
right.
Which, to remind listeners, was the legislation that did a whole lot of things, but specifically kind of related to Pillar 2. It would have moved GILTI from a jurisdictional basis to a blended basis to a jurisdictional basis. It would have also increased the corporate rate. I think it was to 26 or 26 and a half.
26 and a half, yeah.
And Professor Grinberg on the podcast kind of talked about that, well, there was the assumption as he was negotiating with Pillar 2, and advocating Europe and others to bring in Pillar 2, that the thought was, well, the U.S. was going to move from the blended regime to a jurisdictional regime. The corporate rate was going to go to 26.5. And then obviously that didn't happen.
Right. And I think that this brings me back to my overarching, thank you for recentering me, by the way. This brings me back to my overarching point. I think about the second piece of legislation that was envisioned by the administration and by Congress. It got through the House Ways and Means markup and off the House floor as kind of containing these international tax changes. I think there was a lot of faith, because of the earlier victories with the American Rescue Plan, that really what we see move through Congress is actually going, not in a totally linear fashion, but that Congress itself is predictable. And that obviously was not the case. And in fact, in a really big bill with very tight margins in the House, you can tell I'm telling this from the House perspective,
Sure.
because I'm emphasizing the tight House margins, which at some point we only had 2 votes. I know that's not quite a Senate 50-50 divide. They had the tougher draw, but the vote margins were very narrow. And again, you just had all this pent up legislative energy about what these members of Congress on both the House and Senate side, what their vision was for this tax bill. That was actually quite different and harder to corral compared to COVID relief legislation. So even though I would say there was a partnership between the executive and legislative branch, often they were talking past each other a little bit, just because they had such different motivations in terms of moving legislation forward.
So when Build Back Better failed, were there, because that then kind of fundamentally undermined the U.S. negotiating position, or the Biden administration's negotiating position with the rest of the world on Pillar 2, that we were going to move to, from the blended to the jurisdictional approach. Were there discussions about potentially having to pivot strategy, as the House Ways and Means or Congress was working with the Biden administration? Do you remember that as a big moment, or was it sort of overshadowed by the cloud of BBB not passing? The way I remember it is this: Build Back Better did actually get off the House floor, and so what I think you're referring to is, which I understand a lot of people interpret as a failure, is it kind of moving over to the Senate and then not being able, the Senate wasn't able to hold a vote on it. Right.
So it was kind of in this languishing period where it's like, well, what's going to happen? I remember going on a congressional staff delegation over to the OECD, and that was the main question. And it was, we could direct it to our Senate colleagues. What's going to happen in terms of, is the Senate going to pick up this legislation again? Will it include international tax things? So it was, we joke about Pillar 1 being kind of in suspended animation. It was almost in that same zone in terms of, well, what is the Congress going to do next? Is it going to try to pass what passed out of the House, or is there going to need to be, an action forcing mechanism? Will there need to be changes? Will the EU need to move first was a big question in everyone's mind. So the debate was still going, and it wasn't quite overshadowed by the fact that Build Back Better wasn't taken up by the Senate, because there was still this idea that, well, Senate's going to try again. They just need to get all of their senators who are currently being senators and exercising their prerogative to hold up a vote to get what they want. And so that was the tenor. That's not to say that the House wasn't extremely disappointed, because we thought we were revving up for a December 21 passage, hooray. And there was a lot of work put into that bill, and a lot of House members voted on revenue raisers that were tough, and then didn't have a guarantee that it would get done in the Senate.
So the day after, and maybe I'm not using the right, I say Build Back Better failed, and maybe that the Build Back Better is not going forward.
Yes.
The day after that, on December 20th, the OECD released the Globe Model Rules. Which, there had been a lot of discussion, and I think the income inclusion rule and the fact that it was going to be jurisdictional, but the big changes, or the big shock, if you will, I think back then was when those model rules came out, there was the introduction, or maybe I'm going to call it the introduction of the undertax profit rule, fundamentally different than an undertax payment rule, which I mentioned is analogous to our BEAT. The U.S. BEAT, base erosion anti-abuse tax, and then the introduction of this thing that kind of appeared that at least I hadn't heard a lot of discussion, which was the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, and frankly, not necessarily representing Congress, or if you do have any recollection from that time, but really your views on, because that really was a fundamental shift, right? The undertax profit rule from the undertax payment rule as this really powerful enforcement mechanism in theory to try to require all the jurisdictions to be able to enact these rules. But maybe share your perspectives on that.
It was perceived as a big shift. It was. And the QDMTT, I think, hit first more than the payments to profit, even though I think both were certainly noticed. I do remember discussing, say, rule ordering under QDMTTs. That was identified as an issue very early. Discussing maybe some of the, I guess, extraterritoriality is kind of, a harsh word for this. It can become a little politicized, but some of the extraterritorial aspects, perhaps, of the revamped UTPR, really coming to the political forefront. And but I think at the same time, again, there was this desire to get tax legislation done and to support the president in order to get everything across the finish line. But I think those two things, and the building of a very different system, both on the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 front, by the way. There was a huge pivot on Pillar 1 as well. So I think it was kind of part and parcel of a vision, but it was a vision that I think, there was an underlying policy rationale to it. I just don't know that the messaging behind that rationale or the rationale itself really landed with Congress in a way where the Senate, and failure is fine, I'll just shed a little tear. After the failure of Build Back Better, whether that could be politically sustained in the Senate, given how shaky the legislation was to begin with.
So one of the big challenges that we know that has really risen from a U.S. perspective is the idea of the refundable versus the non-refundable credits, and the fact that the U.S. R&D credit is non-refundable, and compared to other jurisdictions, and we're obviously waiting for guidance on a side-by-side agreement to see what happens with that. Was Congress involved at all, to your recollection? Was this an issue that was raised? And I appreciate that you moved over to Treasury in 2023. This felt like a pretty glaring and big issue, particularly moving into 2024 when major economies had implemented an income inclusion rule and were potentially R&D credits that were being provided by the U.S. fisc was just effectively going to other jurisdictions that had an income inclusion rule, where those R&D credits were significant enough to move a taxpayer's Pillar 2 rate below 15%. Was Congress involved in that? And maybe Share a little bit about that.
Yes, very, very much so. And the reason I laugh a little bit is because I know that the R&D credit is the driver now. And don't get me wrong, it was a huge driver then and was identified as an issue. An issue that, by the way, there wasn't like a very good political solution to. I think that, on the one hand, I totally understand. I think this was true under the Trump administration, the Trump 1 administration, and the Biden administration. There was a thinking that the corporate rate would be higher than it actually ended up being.
And Professor Grinberg says that he would say, we thought it was going to be 26.5. This wasn't going to be an issue. So.
And you even remember in the Trump administration, I don't know that even, I'll defer to my Republican colleagues on this, but even at the beginning of that administration, I don't know that we thought we'd all get down to 21%. Yeah. That was a pretty significant drop. At the time, really, the debates around before that had been like, oh, maybe like 23, 25, something like that, because we were at 35. So anyway, like I do want to point that out on their behalf. There was a lot on both sides. It's not even a partisan thing that everyone expected the rate to be higher.
Yeah.
The other thing that brought the other credit issue that brought things to the forefront were, while we were doing Build Back Better, that was the first time the green energy credits got introduced where there was a direct pay mechanism. And so there was a huge question, because there wasn't any clarity in the model rules as to whether, or under what the OECD had laid out at the time in terms of, what about these direct pay credits? Right. Are they grants? Are they, because they're, do they count as refundable credits? And so there were some marketable credits. And so there was this huge tension with, on the one hand, the Biden administration had put out, and Congress was fully behind this, a green energy agenda or a climate change agenda that had a lot of political support. And then on the other hand, you had this tax credit issue that was coming out of the Pillar 2 negotiations that could potentially undermine the value of the green energy credits that, really did have the carrying power, as we saw what happened in the Senate with the IRA.
Right, and to remind listeners, the Biden administration was successful in convincing the OECD, because we later got administrative guidance that effectively carved out, or carved in, I guess, your perspective on the market transferable tax credits.
Yes.
But there was no change at that time to the refundable versus the non-refundable credits. Right. So at least it salvaged the green energy credits from a Pillar 2 perspective, from a U.S. policy perspective, but it left the door open on the refundable tax credits.
That's right. And I think there was, I think that this is a funny misperception on Congress. I think there's, understandably, people want to do a Republican and Democratic divide. I totally get that. That's what we see on the news all the time. But I think sometimes there's a misjudging in terms of missing the nuances. I think there was often a view that, if you want to get something done, if we want to fix this problem, maybe Congress can just make credits refundable, maybe, and it's very difficult because there are different factions. I'm sure there were some offices that would be like, let's do what the president says. I'm behind the global minimum tax. I'm all for it. But then you get the cost, even on, I shouldn't even say even on the Republican side, there's a huge political problem with doing, kind of corporate welfare is a big issue too. So it's, even on all sides, even on supporters of the credit, there are all kinds of political complications. So just going in and saying, we'll fix this by legislation, I think was also a little problematic in Congress's view, and not really a path forward on the problem, which is, I should shout out to the very talented Treasury negotiators who were able to come up with the very convincing policy arguments to ensure that some of those incentives were protected and got the more favorable treatment.
Under the administrative guidance.
Mm-hmm. Under the administrative guidance.
Okay, so I want to now move to Trump 2.0. So you moved to the Treasury Department in 2023. And we're there for the transition from Biden to Trump 2.0. I mean, just a fascinating time for you to be in government. Just all that you are able to see. We're not even talking about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and OB3. That can be another podcast, Beth. But tell us a little bit about, particularly because you were at the Treasury Department at this time, the day one executive order, just sort of the whiplash that I think a number of people felt maybe, I don't think this was a surprise to a number of us that the Trump administration was not going to support the U.S.'s support behind Pillar 2. But what was that like? The introduction of Section 891, which was a code provision that not many of us had spent much time with. What was that like, that day one, and it was pretty phenomenal to me that we had a day one executive order on international tax.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for a long time, and it was like, wow, this was, at the front. But what was Treasury's involvement, or maybe give some of the perspective on that?
Yeah, so I need to point out again that I was a career staffer, so it's not like I was involved in the high politics of putting executive orders together. That being said, so it was a surprise to me too, I guess. Okay. In the same way that you're describing, I kind of expected something, but I didn't know it would be a day one, hit the ground running type of situation. Yeah. And I bet some of the audience or the listeners here, have scrutinized that executive order. But when it hits your desk, I think there's a temptation to say, okay, this is like a legal document, and now I'm going to see what all the definitions are and where the inconsistencies are. No, these are very much political statements.
Right. Like G7 statements.
Exactly. So first and foremost, I think the task of the Treasury, especially, because we were not staffed up politically very much at the time. The only tax-dedicated political staffer we had in the building was Derek Tyre, who at the time was counselor to the secretary. It really, we needed to distill it into negotiating guidance that we could use. And so that was the first task immediately of the career staff under the oversight of the political staff that were in the building, and there were not many. Yeah. So, I mean, it was very interesting because there were all kinds of, not all kinds, but there were capitalized terms, for instance, where there was ambiguity as to whether, say, global tax deal meant Pillar 1, Pillar 2. We started getting questions on that right away. How big is the scope here? Who should send the emails is a question when you get the notification, the executive order said you need to notify the OECD that this doesn't apply in the US. Just kind of the nuts and bolts of this. It just needs to be figured out in a transition. And then you have to put on okay, what are the principles can I distill from this from a negotiating perspective? How do I approach the other countries about that? And can I, in the context of this executive order, approach other countries on a multilateral level without unintentionally messing with some other part of the administration that is doing some foreign policy work that I don't know anything about. So it was a bit of a wild time, but I think the Treasury negotiators, to their credit, have done a really good job of sticking with what those principles are in the executive order. It really has been their touch point the whole time, and I have to say I've been really impressed that they've gone back to those first principles because it was a bit of a scramble.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me, and somebody who's never worked in the government and but have lived in the U.S. my entire life. It's an important point, I think, for both U.S. listeners as well as our non-U.S. listeners, this point on the political appointees and these tens of thousands of people that we have that are nonpartisan, that have been working for the government, that have to effectively drive the policies, of course, of the administration in charge. And that was your role in Treasury.
Yes, that's right. And, the folks who do that, especially when you're coming from a foreign policy and negotiating perspective, it's very important, to have that oversight. And every time, and this is, again, this nonpartisan statement, every time you have a transition in an administration, you're losing political appointees, and it takes a while for them to get in the door.
Sure.
So you always have this kind of tension, and this is why, for instance, you can see when a new administration comes in, maybe regulatory efforts really stop for a while, or things kind of grind to a halt because you need that political structure to come in. And I think that just navigating that tension with the very keen interest from the president on this issue was one of the more interesting times in my public service career.
I can only imagine. All right, so last topic I want to cover, and I do want to remind listeners that we are recording this before we've received any side-by-side or lack thereof agreement. But what I want to talk to you about was Section 899. And if you can give a little bit of context as to that process, where 899 was originally proposed by Chairman Smith from House Ways and Means, I think a couple years ago. And then ultimately it was brought into the House version of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, so OB3. And then it significantly changed as to the Senate version. And then it was removed after we had that G7 agreement.
Yes.
Do you have any insights on 899 and sort of Treasury's involvement with Congress? Because they were obviously working very closely because the Secretary of the Treasury, Besant, was the one who had negotiated the G7 and then obviously worked with the Congress to have that removed from the legislation. That, Beth, really, I mean, I was shocked by that G7 announcement. And, you know, we had spent a lot of time talking to taxpayers and people were concerned about 899, and then all of a sudden it was out. But what, can you shed any light on that experience?
I mean, I can try. It was a bit of a crazy summer. And again, like this is all, the real decision-making power is not with the career staff, it's with the political staff. But, you know, those of us who had been involved in the Pillar 2 negotiations and providing technical assistance to the House of Representatives on 899, were following this very closely. This is, the way I remember 899, I think, is slightly different than the typical story. The conclusion is the same, but I'll just, put it out there. So when 899 first entered the House bill and it was, made public, and you're right, the legislation had been around for a while. It would be kind of unfair, I think, to call it a message bill, but that's exactly like how it functioned.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it was introduced during the Biden administration and was really the legislative vehicle for, I think, Republican consternation around how the Biden administration had done the OECD negotiations, and in a way that they perceived as kind of a constitutional infringement on tax sovereignty. So, it had been around for a while, but I think that I don't know that its impact as an actual moving piece of legislation had fully been taken on board by taxpayers, by other countries, until it actually hit the House floor, I guess.
It was quite a shockwave.
Yes, it was a shockwave. It was, and I think the typical story that you hear is, and that's what blew open the negotiations. And even though people had been struggling and maybe some countries had been slow walking, that's what really got the G7 statement together. What happened first was, as you can imagine, this thing hit, and negotiations basically stopped for a while because of the far-reaching impact of the provision and what it could mean. And because, I think to their credit, the other countries who had lived through the negotiations on Pillar 2, where Congress did not deliver on a country-by-country system, were like, well, what do I expect Congress to do next? Because they're quite unpredictable. Even if Treasury tells me that they're talking with them, that there might be, that there's some space here, do I even believe it? Because I have recent history.
Once bitten, twice shy.
Yeah, exactly. Albeit under, different circumstances. But so I think there was there was a suspension of negotiations that I didn't get the sense it would turn into an impasse, but many countries did, again, understandably need to go back to their finance ministries and say, what are we going to do about this? Because now the U.S. Congress is involved, and it's a bit of a stochastic actor in the minds of many. And so, as much as I do think Section 899 created momentum towards bringing people to the table and saying, it might be worth it to at least agree on these principles in order to get this looming threat off of the table, there was really some nervousness and quite a lot of angst about the fact that the Congress was legislating on this while the executive branch was saying, we would like to move ahead here, that, threw some sand in the gears. At the same time, I do think that, a lot of the outreach by countries on foreign direct investment and its impacts, a lot of the outreach by other companies did impact the debate moving forward in the Senate, such that there was like a political softening that also could make a deal possible on removing 899 from the Senate bill. Often I think, friends from who maybe sit on the other side of the table for other jurisdictions or kind of observers, often say that, oh, do you think that Section 899 would have been removed by the Byrd Rule? Or isn't it true that there was like this political agita around it in the Senate that made this deal maybe not so expensive for Treasury in the long run because there were political problems with it anyway? I don't think that's true. What I do think is true is there was a lot of noise around that provision, but at the end of the day, I will tell you the House of Representatives was super keen on having that in. And I think that at the end of the day, it was the close relationship that Treasury had forged with the Congress that carried the day on getting 899 out of the Senate version of the bill. After all of this back and forth that I've probably rambled.
No, this is amazing. This is fantastic context, Beth. So we're going to leave this as a cliffhanger here because, again, as we record this, it's really the last kind of working week here in December 16th. We don't know what's happening with the side-by-side agreement, but we're going to get back together on the other side of the holidays here and reflect on whether we did or did not get a side-by-side agreement and what that may mean. This is fantastic context, and I'm really interested in trying to record and document some of the history of Pillar 2. It's been fascinating to watch it evolve, and I think, again, everybody's so focused on Pillar 2. I like going back and reminding people, a lot of this started with Pillar 1 and DSDs, and you provide some helpful context and also some very interesting perspective, first of all, being a career person in the government, working at the Senate, working at the House, working at Treasury during a very dynamic time. Would also certainly like to hear more about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because you were in Congress as a part of that, as well as with the OB3 bill. But we'll have to save that for a later podcast. So Beth, great to, first of all, welcome to PwC. We're so thrilled to have you. Thanks for coming on the Cross Border Tax Talks podcast. And then I look forward to talking to you on the other side of the holiday and about side-by-side, about 899. Who knows what we might be talking about.
Yes, well, thank you for today's therapy session. We'll see what happens next.
I love it. All right. So thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Beth Bell, a principal in PwC's Washington National Tax Services Policy Office. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of the Cross Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.